Welcome to Good Sex at NYU, a podcast about sex, relationships, health, and mental health in a sex-positive space. So if you're looking for sometimes serious, sometimes funny, and always sex-positive discussions, then you're in the right place. I'm Danielle Elliman, Associate Director of Sexual and Relationship Respect Services at Counseling and Wellness Services. I use she, her pronouns.
And I am April Fellers, a nurse and sexual health educator at the Student Health Center. I also use she, her pronouns. We are two white, cisgender, heterosexual, female-identifying clinicians, one with a medical background and the other with mental health experience, who seek to create a space that is inclusive of all identities, backgrounds, and perspectives. Today on Good Sex at NYU, we are joined by Professor Pekka Santilla. Dr. Santtila is a professor of psychology at NYU Shanghai and a global network professor at NYU. Previously, he was a professor of applied psychology and dean of the Faculty of Arts, Psychology, and Theology at the Åbo Akademi University in Finland. His research interests are in legal psychology and human sexuality. His focus in human sexuality aims to understand and develop treatments for sexual dysfunctions.
So welcome, Dr. Pekka. I want to just thank you for joining us. And I want to just ask if you can share a little bit more with us about what sexual dysfunction actually means, and maybe a little bit more about how you became interested in this particular topic.
So thanks, April, Danielle. Good to be here. And, thanks for the invitation to participate. Sexual dysfunctions, one way to put it is that it's a problem that occurs at any time during sexual activity, also including, before sexual activity, whether somebody's interested in engaging in sex. And, there are a number of these, but like a quick listing would be that there are a few that can affect anybody. So that would be lack of interest, lack of desire for sex, and then inability to become sexually aroused, so the desire part is kind of the more, thought part of it. So do I want to have sex? And whereas the arousal part is more a physiological phenomenon. And then there's, as a third one, that can affect anybody. So there would be also pain with intercourse. And then there are sexual dysfunctions that affect individuals with, penises. So erection difficulties getting an erect penis that is sufficient to engage in sexual intercourse. Then we have ejaculation happening very fast, so that it bothers the person involved. And then also ejaculation happening, in a delayed manner. So it takes a long time or is completely absent. And then somebody with a vagina could experience inability to achieve orgasm. And then there could be insufficient vaginal lubrication. And then finally also there could be inability to relax the muscles on the vaginal walls so that there is, the possibility of having penetrative sex. And when I list these things, so it's very clear that it's kind of a normative perspective on, what functional sex is. Mm-hmm. But it's important to emphasize that, it's not only the presence of one of these problems, so to say, but it's also that the person experiences that this is a problem for them, or that the couple experiences that this is a problem for them. So for kind of an official diagnosis to be able to be given to a person, so then, both these elements need to be there. So there has to be this kind of a problem from this list, but then the person or persons also need to feel that this is a problem for them. So like if somebody's uninterested in sex and they experience that they also don't want to be interested in sex, and this is not a problem for them, so then they would not qualify for one of these diagnoses. But that's not to kind of like to say that there would not be kind of a normative element to these. But at the same time, so many of these issues, so if they affect people who would want to have a sex life, so then, they can be quite disturbing to the person. Yeah. And the second part, so kind of became interested in sex research because I had a professor at my school at this Åbo Academy University in Finland, and Professor Kenneth Santtila, and so it was possible to specialize in sexology within my clinical psychologist exam. So that's kind of how it started. And then, as many things in life that you start, so then you just keep on doing them. So there's kind of an inertia effect there as well. But I think one thing that keeps me motivated to look at these issues is that that not many people do, and people who experience these issues as problems. So it would be good if somebody tries to find out if there's something that can be done. So that's one of the reasons. So there's a lack of research and attention at sexual problems.
I really like the way that you framed that, in thinking about the normative behavior, and that it's only really considered a problem if you think it's a problem. Because I think our society often says, oh, you have a problem if, this happens, or this, I just think that it's really well framed that it's a matter of what's going on for you, and not necessarily what society and culture says. If you're okay, with your sex life, then that's okay. It doesn't necessarily mean you're experiencing a sexual dysfunction.
Of course, one issue there is that, I don't do clinical work myself, but what I try to teach the students is that it's important to kind of explore this issue with a person who comes and explains that they have, a sexual problem, for example. So it may be helpful to explore where this comes from. So to what extent it is kind of they are experiencing this problem, it's bothering them as well, as opposed to it being kind of an expectation. And then, because sex is often had in the context of relationships, so then it's even more important to try to figure out. So are both individuals in a relationship experiencing one of these listed issues as a problem, right? So you have to be sensitive to those issues, but yeah.
Right. Does one person have a lack of desire and that's okay with them, but their partner wants more sex? And so how do they have a happy, healthy relationship? And is that compatible for both of them? Are they a good partnership to stay in a relationship? Or if this person is okay not having sex and one person really wants more, do they need other options? And I think that's why sex therapy in a clinical setting is so important, to kind of help people to find what is best for both of them. So I'm glad that you are teaching students and that they can hopefully go out and do that therapy and have those conversations.
Absolutely. But I think there is, that being said, and you put it very well, and that's what I try to, get the students also to kind of think about. So, but it's undeniable that there are cultural and normative elements to this, what we think would be a good solution for a person in terms of their sex life. So one has to but one has to try to be critical and be aware of the factors that are influencing oneself, and then also which are influencing the client, and then think about those things together.
Yeah, in our podcast we often talk about the 4 eyes of oppression, and I feel like this is touching on some of that as well, in that sometimes there's an ideology out there that you're supposed to, as someone with a penis, be able to last a really long time. Right. And so that's what culture says. But that doesn't always necessarily mean that you have to. And so I'm wondering, if you could share a little bit more about your work around premature ejaculation, maybe sort of defining that and telling us a little bit more about that. I'd really love to hear. Yeah.
So that's been one of the objects of my research, to try to understand premature ejaculation. And, so some researchers prefer to call this rapid ejaculation or fast ejaculation or sensitive ejaculation. There are different names. The one used most in research is premature ejaculation. But of course, it already implies that there is a problem, right? Because it's premature. So, but I'm going to stick to that because that's most used in research. And, basically, if we think about, so what is this type of a problem then? So it would then be a client that is worried about their ejaculation, and that from their perspective it happens too fast. And so we could then look at the timing, right? And it's been suggested in research that like 1 minute would be a cutoff. So like if penetrative sex lasts less than 1 minute, so then you would kind of tentatively classify the person as suffering from premature ejaculation, whereas if the intercourse lasts longer, so then you would not. But that's like, of course, completely arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you may need arbitrary cutoffs for the purposes of research to have like homogeneous groups that you are looking at.
Right.
Another like, important aspect of premature ejaculation is that that the person experiences that they don't have control over over the timing of the ejaculation. So they cannot prolong the time, and they also cannot make ejaculation happen faster. So they like don't have a control over it. And at this premature end of the spectrum, so then it would be that they cannot delay ejaculation. And this is the most common male sexual problem. There are many less individuals who like have an ejaculation latency, the duration of penetrative sex being less than 1 minute. There are many more individuals who experience that, from their perspective, this is very brief, and they would want to kind of have longer penetrative sexual episodes, and that they have this feeling of lack of control over that. So you get, different types of prevalences, but it could be in tens of percentages of men who individuals who report this. So there are some definitional problems there. So what is this about? And then, as I said, so then you also require the person to be like very distressed about this issue. One aspect of premature ejaculation is also that it's a relational issue as well, because then like if we have kind of a straight relationship, so there's been some research into the female partners of men who report premature ejaculation, and these female partners, so they also have more sexual dysfunctions than female partners of men without premature ejaculation. Like whether those problems are caused by the premature ejaculation of the male, or whether like two individuals predisposed to having sexual problems is the reason for this association. So that is unknown. And, you can make a case for both directions, right? So it's possible that there are both types of situations. Yeah. But female partners of men with PE or premature ejaculation, so they report often that they have unsatisfying sex lives. So that's kind of like, how to describe it.
Yeah. And I know that sometimes I've heard premature ejaculation be attributed to anxiety or trauma, or those things that could potentially be dealt with in more of a mindfulness or a clinical psychology perspective. But I think that in some of your research, you do talk about the autonomic nervous system being potentially involved as well. Could you share some of like what that looks like and how that can sometimes play a role in premature ejaculation?
Sure. So, like, just to kind of put briefly what we know about the etiology, the causes underlying premature ejaculation is that we don't know the cause of premature ejaculation. So the search for why, why of this phenomenon is ongoing. And just like as a side note to that, so it's the case that probably like if we think from an evolutionary perspective, so there's been no selection against very fast ejaculation. So under kind of circumstances where there could be many types of threats in the environment, for example, predators, so completing sexual intercourse fast, so that may have been advantageous. Mm-hmm. And also, of course, like if you would be having an extra pair relationship with somebody, so then it might also be advantageous. So that may mean that very fast ejaculations are, from that perspective, completely normal. So like there is nothing untoward in having a very fast ejaculation. It's then the social relational aspects and the expectations we now have of what like a good sex life would look like that causes some individuals to experience these problems. But then, so we do have some indications that the autonomous nervous system might be involved in premature or fast ejaculations. And that's not surprising because basically the autonomous nervous system, so that's the part of the nervous system that is not under complete conscious control. So our central nervous system is supposedly under our control, at least some of the time, right? But the autonomous nervous system is not under our control, and most of the time. So the autonomous nervous system, so it has these two interplaying components. There's the sympathetic part, which, for example, causes this fight-flight reaction is involved in that. So it's associated with heightened excitation of the body and prepares the body for like activity. And then there's the parasympathetic part, which is more involved in the resting state. And interestingly, so for the male sexual function, so the parasympathetic part needs to be activated to relax the muscles of the penis so that blood flow into the penis is possible and then, can result in an erection. So that requires that kind of like, some sort of like calmness. You should not be nervous or in a fight-flight mode.
Right.
Yeah, and then so parasympathetic activation allows erection to happen, and then for ejaculation to happen, there needs to be a peak in sympathetic activity. So this interplay is intricate, and I mean this is kind of a crude model of what is going on. Mm-hmm. So then, like, it could then be that some individuals, so they have kind of an imbalance between these, or a balance that is not optimal for kind of allowing a little bit longer intercourse, resulting then in an ejaculation. But instead, if an individual has kind of heightened level of sympathetic activity all the time, so that could be like a genetic property of the person, but it could also be situational in the sense of what, April, you said, that there might be like worries, there might be anxieties going on in the sexual situation. So the person might be like worrying about their performance. And for example, they might be worried that they are going to like have a very fast ejaculation. Mm-hmm. So that would then increase their sympathetic activation level and then result in a fast ejaculatory response. So that's kind of like one model, and there are other factors as well. So what's been replicated a few times, but it also fits with this model, is kind of lack of physical exercise. So if you are not in a good physical condition, so if we talk about typical kind of heterosexual sexual script and the penetrative sexual acts involved, so then those would require more strenuous kind of physical activity from the male. And, then, you might get exhausted. So that might be related to a fast ejaculation. And then one kind of a separate framework, and there's some support for that as well, is lack of interoceptive awareness. So that's kind of a mouthful. So what's interoceptive awareness? So it's the awareness of our internal bodily processes. So basically, like one way to measure if somebody is aware of what's happening inside their body is whether people can hear their heart beating.
Oh, interesting.
Just like, if you lie calmly on the bed and then you try to listen. So can you hear your heart beating? So in some situations, people might, like, if they have done a lot of exercise, so they might. But many people don't. And for example, I don't hear my heart beating, but some people do. And once I realized, so then you can kind of ask people. So some people, so think about it, we are so different. So the internal life is so different. So some of us hear our heart beating, mm-hmm. Some of us don't. So that's kind of like interesting. So how is this related to premature ejaculation? It seems to be the case that if somebody lacks interoceptive awareness, so they don't really kind of notice so easily what's going on inside their body, so this is a risk factor for premature ejaculation.
Interesting.
And that's like kind of interesting, right? Because some of the kind of classic advice to men for them to like not have a fast ejaculation would be try to distract themselves from the situation. But that might make things worse, because then if a person tries to distract themselves from the sexual situation, and the idea there is that by like thinking about something like not sexual, so they would decrease their arousal level, and that would, then make them last longer. But fundamentally, this is not a problem of arousal. So sexual arousal. So that will not be very effective. And instead, what happens is that this person becomes even less aware of what is going in their body. So they cannot notice kind of the internal signals that an ejaculation is imminent. Because there's a point in the sexual response cycle where the person will, have a point after which they cannot prevent the ejaculatory reflex. Mm-hmm. But if you have good interoceptive awareness, so you will kind of internally notice signs of this imminent threshold approaching. And then, like, the idea would be that perhaps it's possible to then take control of this situation when you notice those signs. So it's there where, for example, relaxation techniques and being in the moment, so could be helpful interventions potentially. And at least there's kind of a clear theoretical basis of exploring whether those kinds of exercises would be and could be helpful.
I think that's helpful I was going to ask you some suggestions that you had in terms of things that people could do, both emotionally or psychologically, to kind of see if that works. And then also, if you were to see somebody with premature ejaculation, at what point would you recommend that they see a medical doctor? There are medical causes potentially of premature ejaculation, and also specifically erectile dysfunction. And so when from your perspective, do you recommend some at-home remedies or things that they can try versus recommending that they see a doctor?
So one thing kind of like to think about before suggesting some things that people could do is to kind of emphasize what I said earlier, that this is a relational problem. So one possibility of approaching this is that if the person and their partner, so if they are both agreed, so they could adjust their sexual scripts to kind of live with it. So there's not necessarily anything to be changed. So it might be kind of like a matter of negotiating. So that the person having the PE problem, so they could first put more, attention to the other person's sexual enjoyment. And then this might not be a problem at all. So like, that's one thing. And I think like that component should always be there. Like, it's possible to discuss these issues and, think of like solutions that may not necessarily require somebody changing. And I think like it's so important also to emphasize this because, perhaps not everybody can be helped by the so-called remedies that are like suggestions that are around. So that doesn't need to mean that they are doomed to having an unsatisfying sex life. Mm-hmm. Rather, actually, like a PE problem might, be an opportunity to explore the sexual scripts and make them more varied. So, and if we think like globally, also the kind of the emphasis on male sexual enjoyment may then make many men not be bothered by very fast ejaculation, but then that ignores female sexual enjoyment. Mm-hmm. So the fact that men are bothered by this problem in straight relationships, so that kind of shows that they are concerned also about the other person's enjoyment. So that's kind of like the background to that. And there are medications that medical doctors can prescribe to somebody with PE, and these are usually kind of like based on SSRI type of medications, because we know that there's kind of a side effect of SSRIs, which is lack of libido or lowered libido. So that's kind of the mechanism there. And there's some promise with them, but many users stop using them because of the side effects. So they have some side effects. And also, like in clinical studies, they might have kind of like big statistical impact. But if we are starting from 60 seconds and then we move to 90 seconds, so that's like a big impact statistically.
Mm-hmm.
But is that meaningful for the relationship, right? So that's another issue. And yeah, physical exercise is something I'm interested in exploring. Mm-hmm. So like I have a study out where we showed, and it's not the first time that a physical exercise intervention has been done, but we showed that kind of a high intensity interval training type of exercise so had a positive impact among men who had PE. And why would that be? So like in that first study, we couldn't really assess kind of the process variables themselves, but it was based on this sympathavagal or this sympathetic parasympathetic model, because that type of high intensity physical exercise, so it kind of has like a calming effect on the autonomous nervous system, on the sympathetic part of the nervous system. So that could be one thing, but there are like potential other mediators. We also found that those participants who did the physical exercises for 2 weeks, so they also kind of felt better about their bodies. Mm-hmm. So then but that could ultimately feed to the same mechanism. So if you feel better about your body, so then you might, not have so many negative thoughts about yourself in the sexual situation. So that might decrease sympathetic arousal. And like one thing, of course, is that it's very unlikely that in 2 weeks of kind of physical exercise, you would have any objective changes to your body, like weight changes, or those would be minor. Mm-hmm. But like people feel better about themselves and perhaps have better stamina during the sexual activity. Mm-hmm. So that's, something. And then some research has suggested that kind of pelvic floor exercises, pelvic floor muscle exercises could be beneficial as well.
In both, in the person with a penis?
Yeah.
I think a lot of times I hear pelvic floor exercises related.
Yeah, to they are recommended for women, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but also recommended for men, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of like what could be said about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's helpful. I noticed in a lot of the research that I've read of yours and some of our conversation here today that, we're sort of looking at men who have female partners and vaginal intercourse. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the impact of those who maybe have anal penetration or men who have sex with men. I mean, is there like an active choice to choose one or the other, or are both being researched? And is there any kind of variation or difference when it comes to looking at that for PE?
Yeah. And it's important that you bring it up. So like research into this area, like, is kind of given kind of the time we live in. So it's surprising. It has been some of the research has been surprisingly heterosexist. Mm-hmm. And like, for example, so there was a suggestion that PE would be defined as a, penile vaginal penetration latency time of less than 1 minute. So that, then by definition, mm-hmm. Anybody not engaging in penile vaginal sex could not, have PE. And that's like, of course, complete nonsense. So a lot of the research and also like some of my studies have been done with cis men who have female partners. So that's like, but why so? So like now in this study that I just finished in China, so then, there are like confoundings to consider because many men who are interested in men, they still have female partners. Mm. So like if we are recruiting from a normal population sample, so to say, like we go to some, research sample surveys. And we ask men to participate. So if we find men who are sexually interested in men, many of them might have, female partners. So that's kind of like a confounding, because then the arousal processes, they might, when engaging in sexual activity with their female partners, so there might be issues related to insufficient arousal. So then that would kind of like make it harder for us to identify the issues. Mm-hmm. But together with my colleagues, so we collected a large sample of men from a Chinese gay dating app, Blood, and we are analyzing the results. So in that, from those data, we'll get a really detailed understanding of men having sex with men in China and what kinds of sexual dysfunctions they are experiencing. Like most of there is research, but there's not been a lot of attention to the sexual dysfunction side. I mean, this is like true in general as well, because LGBT individuals, so they are seen a lot in research through the lens of like identity issues. Mm-hmm. But there's not a lot of attention to sexual dysfunctions. So there's not a lot into that. So like in that sample, I hope to be able to assess in detail also premature ejaculation issues with in men who have sex with men. There is from previous research, there is some indication that there would be like a difference between gay and straight men in their sexual dysfunction profile. So that, straight men would have more PE, premature ejaculation problems, and gay men more erectile dysfunction problems. That's not been always replicated, but it's been found a few times. And we don't exactly know what's going on there. What could this be about? Just as a side note, so in this sample, so what I'm interested in also understanding where kind of the sexual dysfunction literature, so it meets STI or sexually transmitted infection literature, is something called condom-associated erectile dysfunction, has been talked about in the literature, which means that, if you ask a sample of individuals having penises and why they don't want to use a condom, so a quite common response relates to sensations and some awkwardness and unavailability, and so forth. But if you query people in more detail, so what you also found is that many individuals report that they don't want to use a condom because they are afraid of losing their erection while trying to put it on. Because of course, attention goes from the sexually arousing stimuli in that situation to kind of handling the putting on the condom. So you change the focus, the attention from your partner to yourself, and that may then be associated with an increase in these negative cognitions and thoughts about performance and fear of losing the erection and so forth. So that may be a more common reason than realized. And and also it's pretty amazing, in a negative sense, that there's not a lot of kind of product development in that area to think about how condoms could be more user friendly. Yeah.
Maybe that's another research project. You've mentioned a little bit about it seems like a lot of the research that you're doing, because you're based in Shanghai, is with Chinese people that live in China. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about how that research, the cultural implications of the research that you're doing, and how that could potentially translate, or what some of the limitations might be in translating that data across other cultures or countries.
I think in this research into premature ejaculation, when exploring the efficacy of, for example, physical exercise interventions, so I would expect little difference. The idea would be, as psychologists sometimes perhaps exaggerate a little bit, that there are universalities, and the functioning of the autonomic nervous system would be one of those. So if this hypothesis about the balance of these two components of the autonomous nervous system is true, and we can establish that when we replicate this research in laboratory. So I don't expect any impact of cultural factors really. But then when it comes to like sex research in general or sexual dysfunction research, so what has been found is that among women, sexual dysfunctions are much more frequent in Asia, in for example, China, than in the West. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows exactly like what's going on there. Is it due to like sexual scripts, or are there some like other reasons that are going on? So I'm going to have a new PhD student starting in September, and with her we are going to work on kind of couple communication interventions, and see whether that would be a fruitful way of approaching this issue, because there's would seem then to be a lot of potential there. Yeah, like there are not a lot of there's not a lot of like sex research done from a psychological perspective. Mm-hmm. But I have not experienced like particular difficulties in conducting the research. So there are some issues, like for example, if we would want to invite participants into the laboratory and show them pornographic materials as stimuli, so that might be problematic, because distributing or showing pornographic material to somebody in China is illegal. Mm-hmm. Consuming yourself doesn't seem like would be legal. So that's an example of a practical issue.
Mm-hmm. I see.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you. And so some of your research focuses on how disgust might impact someone's sexual desire. I hadn't really thought about that actually as a major factor related to sexual desire, but I'm really interested. And it was really fascinating to read some of your work on that. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more, how did you become aware of this, and what have you found in your research?
So like one of the theoretical frameworks I use in my like thinking about psychology is the evolutionary framework. And it's like from kind of seeing the connections between that perspective and then sexual dysfunctions that made me think about this. And it's not me who has kind of like seen the connection between disgust and sexual arousal and the potential for that contributing also to sexual dysfunctions. But basically the idea is that, that disgust would be quite involved in the sexual response. And why is that? I mean, the evolutionary analysis of the emotion of disgust is that it's there to protect us from contagion risk, or from like consuming food that is bad for us, that is like, full of bacteria or so forth. So like we react with disgust if there's kind of rotten food, or if there is a person has a sore that is full of pus and so forth. So that's the reaction. So disgust is there to kind of make us move away from that. And then of course, like one could say that sex is objectively disgusting, right? And like, what do I mean by that? That it presents a contagion risk because of the exchange of bodily fluids. So in sexual activity, there is the possibility of contagion. So how is it then at all possible for people to have sex? So if we have this mechanism of reacting with disgust when there is a risk for contagion, so how is it possible for anybody then to engage in sex? So like usually the way of putting this, like in the framework that we started with, the sexual dysfunction framework, is to see lack of sexual desire or lack of interest in sex. So that's the problem, right? So we need to understand why somebody would have a lack of sexual interest in sex. And here, within this framework, you can kind of like put these things upside down, and you can ask, how is it possible for anybody to engage in sex if there are these disgusting stimuli? So basically, like these two emotions, disgust and sexual arousal, so they are in a negative reciprocal feedback loop. So disgust strong feelings of disgust, they suppress sexual arousal. And then on the other hand, sexual arousal suppresses disgust. So it's the latter mechanism that allows people to engage in sex. So when somebody becomes sexually aroused, so they may then not experience disgust at the thought of engaging in activities involving exchange of bodily fluids with another person. So I think it's fascinating. It's really fascinating because somebody might think that they, meet another person. So somebody might think that, the idea of exchanging saliva with that person. So that's like a disgusting thought. But then a few minutes later, they might think it's the best idea ever. Let's exchange saliva, which has, the possibility of contagion by a number of viruses, parasites, and bacteria. Right. So that's interesting. So the idea then is that in kind of like a positive, healthy sexual function loop, so people, they encounter a sexual stimulus that could be like a sexual approach by somebody, their partner, for example. So they would react with an upregulation of sexual arousal, and that would suppress any disgust. Because a sexual stimulus, a sexual approach, so basically within this framework, so it has both disgusting components, these bodily fluids, but it has also arousing components, the sexual kind of aspects of it. So the key to this healthy loop is that the arousal takes the upper hand and keeps disgust suppressed. And one of the questions I'm interested in is understanding whether through habituation, so then in long-term relationships, people might not have such an immediate, fast sexual arousal response to their partner. And that could make it a little bit tricky, because if disgust takes an upper hand, if you have experienced disgust at the approach of the other person, so that might then lead into a loop where arousal cannot recover from that. So that's what I'm looking at. It's kind of basic theoretical framework is this behavioral immune system, this disgust response, protecting us from contagion that's been presented in the literature. And then looking at how these two emotions interact and what's their role in contributing to sexual dysfunctions. And I've been doing some work now with ginger. Ginger is an anti-emetic. So it's been used, for example, to in surgery to prevent people having nausea after surgery. And it's been shown to be effective. So it may sound surprising, ginger, how is it now related to this disgust arousal feedback loop? But yeah, so we've shown in a few studies that if you administer ginger as opposed to placebo, so it seems to facilitate sexual arousal. And our idea is that it is because ginger is has these anti-nausea properties. So then, disgust is kind of a psychological level representation of those types of processes. So then if you can affect that, so you might facilitate. And we found that it's especially effective than in our studies. These are pretty preliminary results, but it's more effective for women because women have, there is a clear gender difference, so that women have higher disgust reactions in general than men. And there are good reasons to expect that. So it's more effective for women, and then also for anybody who has kind of very kind of strong inhibitory responses related to sex. Yeah. So both anybody who has those types of responses.
That's right. Yeah. So I think the key here is that you'd want to nosh on some ginger before you engage in sex if you have a disgust response. And I'm mostly joking, but maybe there's some truth to that.
Okay, so it seems to be that it takes some 45 to 60 minutes before after consumption of ginger that the effect kicks in. But so what I would say that the research suggests at the moment is that it might not be harmful to drink ginger tea sometimes. That would, and if you are consuming ginger as part of your diet, so yeah, why not, go on doing that?
It's a great tip.
Just to clarify, it doesn't necessarily increase the arousal, because you're talking about arousal decreases disgust, disgust decreases arousal. So taking the ginger doesn't necessarily increase arousal. It just decreases the disgust. So the threshold, the sexual arousal can then.
Yeah. So that would be like, that's our theoretical idea, like based on the model, right?
Yeah.
That, it might inhibit some of the disgust responses and then thereby indirectly facilitate arousal. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned the sexual dysfunction loop. Can you talk about that, the sexual dysfunction loop versus the sexual function loop?
Yeah, like basically, it's not something I know so much about, but kind of the issue here is that people can come into like different trajectories when it comes to their sexual functioning. And if you start with negative socialization experiences, like there are negative attitudes towards sex in the family of origin or, in the larger social environment where you grow up. So that might already like predispose you to have anxious reactions in situations where during sexual encounters. Or there might be some other reasons that you're worried about sexual encounters. So that type of worry makes you kind of focus on yourself during the sexual activities or sexual interactions. And that type of self-focus, especially if it's about performance, whether like, and your appearance, like, do I look attractive to the other person? Am I performing in the right way? If you have those types of like worries, so they predispose you then having experiencing sexual dysfunctions. I mean, it's related to those reasons I explained before about kind of the fight-flight response and kind of anxiety related to these negative thoughts, that those might like be involved in that kind of a situation. And then like if there are a few repeated experiences, negative experiences, so then like that reinforces those negative thoughts. And then you are like in a negative loop. Whereas somebody who may have had a more sex positive upbringing and they may have a personality or some other factors that make them kind of approach these situations focusing on the other person, their own enjoyment and so forth, rather than varying thoughts. So then they are much more likely to have a positive experience. And then that, of course, like then reinforces that in the long run. So then, the likelihood of a negative experience the next time is less. So then like people can have these types of loops. But I think like, so that's kind of like the general model. But like anecdotally, it's interesting that people can jump from, there are like anecdotes of people jumping from kind of a positive loop that has been going on for a long time by the other person's like the other person makes a slight comment about them, and that can like push them over to the negative loop. So that's kind of like, it's unfortunately, it may not be as easy to be like to jump from the negative loop to the positive loop, but it's definitely like possible. But it's interesting, I think, that in this area of sexual interactions, so people can be very like fragile, even though they might have had positive experiences. So like the power of the other person to buy a comment that they might not have thought through really carefully. So those are just like anecdotes that and a comment about some performance related aspect might push somebody to a negative loop for, that's very difficult to get out from.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate hearing like the definition, even though you claim to not be an expert in the loop, but I think it was really helpful because I'm, sitting here thinking about like how much maybe the, sexual dysfunction loop has an impact on disgust, or these outside, indicators that say like, oh, there's certain things that are disgusting in sex. And you hear a lot about, when people want urination or defecation in, and like that's automatically people will be like, ugh, and so like to think like, is that really what I believe and feel in my own sexuality, or is it because like, outside factors are saying that? I think, again, some of that is evolutionary, but just to say like, how much does it come in from the outside, and how much is our instinct coming in when it comes to sexual disgust. So I just found that really helpful.
Yeah, I think like, this issue of kind of more unusual sexual interests. So some of them can be understood within this framework of this disgust arousal kind of like reciprocal loop, because obviously then it is to be expected that for some people, disgust kind of decreases more when they are sexually aroused. And it's not known at the moment, but like that's one of the topics I'm interested in, is to understand whether kind of when somebody is sexually aroused, so the idea is that they then become less disgusted, so they are able to engage in sexual activity. So how specific is that are those things they will be able to do? And then like some individuals, like their disgust reactions might like generally go down, and then, allow or make them interested in more unusual things as well. So that's, I think, like, now I'm not claiming that kind of that this model is kind of, explains everything about sexual dysfunctions or paraphilias or unusual sexual interests, but it's definitely like could be one component worth looking into a little bit.
Yeah. I know another area of your research focuses on sensate focus. I'm wondering if you could describe what that is and maybe some examples of some exercises.
Yeah, so the sensate focus, so this is kind of a classic intervention that sex therapists have used since Masters and Johnson, who are the classics in this area. So presented this idea, and it's related to what I've said, what we've discussed before about kind of the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and how kind of like performance anxiety and anxious thoughts about sex, so they might be related to this sympathetic activation that could then impact negatively sexual function. So the idea with sensate focus is that rather than people like having a very performance-oriented approach to sex, like performance-oriented would mean, a straight couple where the idea is that the man is performing sex and then the woman would also be expected to enjoy penile vaginal penetrative sex. So that kind of like focus on performance and focus on a limited focus on sexual activities. So that could be one of the reasons for then people having problems, because then performance comes with in a package with performance anxiety potentially. And sensate focus is then like a method to try to counteract that. And how to do that. So the idea there is that you have kind of non-demanding touch and intimacy exercises where the focus is not on penetrative sexual activity. And that these exercises would then be helpful in, kind of people becoming sexually aroused and noticing what makes them sexually aroused, and also the couple, the individuals involved, so becoming acquainted with each other and with each other's bodies and so forth. And then there is like research that this is effective. So I've, together with Leslie Huang, so we've been working on a project with Chinese couples with exercises we've shared online with the participants. And some of the examples of this exercise, like one example is that the two persons, so they would be like lying on the bed and facing each other side, like lying on the side and facing each other, and then just looking each other in the eye for a few minutes, and keep it up and not try to kind of laugh it off, because some people kind of resist by making kind of it funny because they have a certain resistance to doing it.
Yeah.
So the idea there is that this is a useful exercise to increase intimacy. And then many of these other exercises involve the couple. One person would be like lying they might have some clothes on, or they might be naked during later phases of these exercises. And the other person would explore non-sexual parts of their body, like touch, for example, them everywhere, but not in sexual parts of the body. And then, switch around, and the other person does the same exercise to the other person. So those are some of the examples. And, we also found that these were effective in increasing intimacy in these Chinese couples, and also specifically decreasing female sexual dysfunctions.
Yeah.
There was no great impact on male sexual dysfunctions, but I think intimacy and then arousal processes. So and women having typically more problems in the desire arousal part of the response cycle. So it would make sense. Yeah.
I think that's really useful for a number of different reasons. And one is because one of the things that we talk about a lot here is just that we need to expand our definition of sex and what that looks like, and what intimacy looks like. Because oftentimes we think of physical intimacy, people instantly think about penetration or sex. And it's like, well, what does that actually mean? And so to use some of these exercises to engage all of our body, because there's so many other things that can be sexual or can be really intimate. I saw some of the videos that you shared with us, and it was just really just nice and relaxing, and really just sort of getting to know someone's body. And if you're going to be intimate with someone, more than once or, over several years, really sort of knowing, all of the different areas that could be pleasurable, I think is really, helpful and useful if you're in any kind of relationship.
I think also going off of, I don't know too much about the Chinese culture, but just hearing you say over and over that, female identifying folks are the ones that have the more sexual dysfunction in heterosexual relationships. And, I think speaking personally and from other people that we've talked to, that, some of those dominant messages that we received growing up was against getting to know your body or exploring your body. And so I think some of these exercises that you're talking about can help alleviate some of that dysfunction that you're talking about, simply because then a person knows their body more. Oh, I didn't realize that this part of my body was pleasurable until we did this exercise. And now and your partner knows, and then that can help in future intimate exercises or experiences. And I think it's a great way to kind of help somebody explore their own body, but then also, like you said, help a partner explore your own body and get to know that too. So it sounds like a great exercise.
Absolutely. And I really think it is fascinating. It's worth thinking about this concept of intimacy more, and these exercises make it also apparent that people can be in long-term relationships and engage in regular sexual activity, but they might not be intimate. Mm-hmm. It might be very scripted and unbalanced, or it might also be unbalanced. But also, if it were balanced in the sense of that the two persons' enjoyment is considered equally, but it might still not be intimate. But anecdotally, so many sex therapists, so they say that the couples who they kind of tell to do these exercises, so some of them have difficulty doing these exercises because they kind of if you've gotten in a longer-term relationship, so if the couple has kind of found a balance, a situation where intimacy is kind of not involved, or it's separated from sexual activity. So then these exercises will kind of create some instability.
Yeah, it's outside your comfort zone.
Yeah.
Yeah, you will be outside your comfort zone, and it what our research suggests that would be helpful. But of course, I think some of the anxiety involved could also be that people might then have to face up to that they may not be a good match. That, because these exercises, raise the question, can we be intimate, and do we want to be intimate again? If it has disappeared. These could also be used, if we have situations where people are inexperienced with sex and then start a relationship. So this might be useful for getting started. Mm-hmm. like be a positive kind of starting point, or they could be used when, sex has become a routine or the relationship doesn't involve sex anymore. But in this kind of latter situation, so this might activate these questions about whether the couple want to stay together, right? So like I do get it, like that looking each other in the eye. So it actually a meaningful thing, or it can activate a lot of questions. And then like one thing about these exercises, of course, that they might, like if we think like globally, so they might not be acceptable for everybody, but like if they are acceptable for a couple, so they could be quite helpful in terms of, some people when they start a relationship, they might be sexually inexperienced and have lack of knowledge and so forth, so do not know what to do with each other. So these exercises could be helpful there as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if either of you have seen the Netflix show Beef, but they have a scene in that show where the husband and wife are like sitting on the bed staring at each other. And I think they were supposed to do it for 3 minutes and they just have a really hard time.
I started watching Beef, but I after a few episodes, I gave up for a moment, but not, I thought it was good, but I have a really like, if something's kind of like, embarrassing, like there is comedy or like embarrassing, so I can have a hard time like
you internalize it.
Oh my gosh, I'm the same way. I don't embarrassing things. I have to speed through that. I hear that.
That's like the whole show then.
Okay, I should not watch that, but okay. So with that, like, I'm fascinated by this conversation. I'm wondering if there are other research areas of interest that you're pursuing, places where folks can find you in your research, because I feel like we just barely hit the tip of the iceberg with some of these topics.
Yeah, well, my contact information is at NYU Shanghai's website. Like I mentioned, one of the projects that I'm looking forward to like working on, which is it's quite kind of similar to these sensate focus things, which is communication, like sexual communication. Mm-hmm. And of course, like that can be communication about sex outside the sexual situation itself, but also communication during the sexual situation itself. Mm-hmm. And is there something that could be done there, like that could be helpful for people to have a more satisfying?
We'll have you back when that comes out, because I think that's something we talk about all the time.
Talking about sex before, during, and after.
That's what we say.
Oh, well, of course, the like communication afterwards as well. That's hopefully then before.
Yes.
Exactly.
Sexual activity.
Yes. Do you teach any undergrad classes? Or mostly
I teach psychology of human sexuality there. Mm-hmm. And then like my other class is legal psychology. Yeah.
Oh, well, great. Well, thanks so much for joining us. I had a really great time learning so much more about some of these topics. And we look forward to having you on again with more of your research, because it seems so relevant to our podcast. Thank you.
Great to meet you. Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
If you have questions about the podcast or anything we talked about today, please feel free to reach out to us at goodsex.podcast@nyu.edu. This email address is monitored during business hours and may take 3 to 4 days for follow-up. We are definitely open to critical and thoughtful feedback, as we didn't cover everything in this episode and might have said something that was inaccurate or that had a negative impact on someone. If you have questions about your sexual health and are an NYU student, you can connect with our Student Health Center sex expert at sexpert@nyu.edu or schedule an appointment through the Student Health Center portal. Look at our show notes for additional information and resources, including organizations, articles, books, and videos.
If you have urgent mental health concerns, safety issues, or you are worried that someone might have caused harm to you, or that you might have caused harm to someone, then you can contact NYU's Confidential Wellness Exchange at 212-443-9999. Chat with them using their mobile app, or email them at wellness.exchange@nyu.edu. For anyone, NYU or non-NYU listeners, you can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673, the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, or the National Mental Health Hotline. Simply dial 988 from anywhere in the U.S.
Thanks for listening, and tune in to our next episode where we continue to talk about good sex at NYU. Subscribe to the podcast to hear all of our quickies and interviews with NYU community members. Thanks to our content contributors for this episode, Bernadette Kerr, Alyssa LaFosse, Dr. Dominic Baini-Amisa, Zoe Raguzios, and to our health promotion team, Anna Genova, Jenny Mellon, Parade Stone, and Arna Dixit, and to Gotham Studios and Karen Ortman.